Okay. So, there we go. Apologies, some technical difficulties. Okay, there we go. So again, hi everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for attending our second conservation education workshop of the year. My name is Bernie Traversari, and I'm the Director of Operations and Programs for SCBNA, the North American region of the Society for Conservation Biology. So the first thing that I'd like to do, even if you joined us for some of our other webinars, is to briefly go over what SCBNA is for those of you that are not familiar with our organization. Briefly put, we are the North American region of the Global Society for Conservation Biology, which is a professional scientific society that is focused on the conservation of biodiversity, healthy ecosystems, and human connections. As a region, our goal is to promote the integration of conservation science and practice, and also to empower all voices that are engaged in conservation. And we do this through a variety of different ways. We have professional development opportunities like this one that we offer throughout the year. We have a couple of scientific journals that folks can submit publications for, and also other types of publications that folks can access. And then we also hold our biannual conference, the next iteration of which is taking place in 2026 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So we really try to create as many opportunities as possible for networking and collaboration for members that are included within our region, and also with members that are included in other regions throughout the society. If you want to learn more about SCBNA and join our organization, you can do so by scanning the QR code here. Otherwise, as we dive into our presentation today, I'll be happy to include a link to our website so you can join via that as well. So this workshop is being organized by the Education Committee of SCBNA. And the goal of the Education Committee is really to focus on conservation education in all of its forms. We develop professional development opportunities for educators at the K through 12, higher education, and informal education levels. And these professional development opportunities can vary from technical skill building to career development to social and networking events. So really trying to integrate anyone who's involved in conservation education in as many ways as possible. So this workshop today is really a part of a series that we're developing over the next year, in addition to other opportunities for engagement. Now, unfortunately, our committee chair, Dr. Martha Groom, wasn't able to join us today, but I have included her contact information here in case you want to join the committee in the future. We're always looking for new members. This is a great way to become initially involved with SCBNA and to learn more about what we're doing, and also to influence some of the professional development opportunities that we're developing over the next year. And I've also included the names of some of our other committee members who have been very integral to this work and who have put in a lot of time and energy in developing this series. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this is a long-running workshop series. Where additional events will be coming up over the next few months. We are currently in the process of reviewing some of the proposals that have been sent to us since the beginning of the year, and we'll likely share additional information about that in the near future. But we are also requesting additional proposals and also requests for proposals from our attendees. So if there's something you would like to see, some type of skill building event you would like us to organize, I encourage everyone to do so by following the link here. I will also copy it to our chat in just a few minutes. This is just a great way to let us know if you're looking for a particular type of professional development opportunity. If we have the ability to organize that, we would love to do so. So it helps us think of creative ways to support you and our members. Okay. So moving on to today's presentation. This is really a continuation of a different conservation education workshop that we prepared at the beginning of the year that introduced BioBlitz as an useful tool for community-based science. Today, we'll be continuing that by looking at ways to operationalize BioBlitz into educational curricula. And in the same way as our previous session, our lead today is Ann Lewis, who is the Interim Executive Director and Special Projects Director at the South Dakota Discovery Center. So I will stop my spiel here, and we'll leave it to Ann to introduce you to the session and what you'll be doing today. Thank you, Ann, for being here.
Great, thank you. Finding it hard to get my mouse over to the mute button, unmute button. So yeah, my name is Ann Lewis, and I don't know if you can see it because it's not centered correctly, but it's actually MacroBlitz that we are going to be talking about today. And well, if you don't know what that is, we'll touch on that, but we'll talk about how to operationalize it. Bernie, are you? Can we launch the poll? So before we get too deep in the weeds about how to operationalize this, I want you to indicate your familiarity with collecting aquatic macroinvertebrates for observation. So 5 means, yes, I've done it a lot. I can spot a darner at 1,000 paces kind of thing. 0, it's like, no, I'm not really, I can't. So this will help guide me. Where are we going to spend our time? Okay. So we're, and if you are the person who's very confident in aquatic macroinvertebrates, if you just want to, and I'll ask everybody to do this in the chat, kind of put down where you are from and what organization you are representing, or what's your raison d'etre to be here today. What was it about this session that's like, ooh, that looks like it could be good. You can go ahead and end the poll, Bernie. It's most folks are 3 and below. We have one person who's very confident. I'll just kind of share the results real quick so that you can see them. But if we could just find out a little bit more about you in the chat. And while we are doing that, I'm going to queue up an overview video about MacroBlitz. MacroBlitz is funded by National Geographic. We're still sopping up the last little bits of funding on that, so I can still use the present tense. And National Geographic, of course, is really big on the sizzle. They like to make things exciting. So to do that, we have an explorer. I'm also a National Geographic explorer. I was working with explorer Isai Madriz, who works out of Patagonia. And while you're thinking about your answer to the question, what organization are you representing, whether it's like a volunteer or master naturalist, or you're a college professor or a high school teacher, or just an interested citizen, you can also watch this. Make sure when I share my screen, I will share the sound and optimize for video clip. Ooh, Siena College, I grew up in Albany, so Colony, actually. All right, let me go make sure I'm sharing the right screen. And here we go.
My name is Isai Madriz. I am an entomologist, zoologist, and National Geographic explorer. I perform exploratory expeditions in remote areas of Patagonia. Our understanding of the natural world is based on observations.
There are small mayflies, small chironomiid flies, non-biting midges. And let's see what else we find.
Aquatic macroinvertebrates are organisms without a vertebra. We still have thousands of new species of insects to discover. We are all called to seek out biodiversity through surveys because we do not know what will happen next with our ecosystems. We must continue sampling our surroundings to better understand how we are influencing the changes in the ecosystems we are a part of. Help us find and document more species and habitats around the globe. Find your local freshwater habitat, collect a sample, photograph and upload your macroinvertebrate images to iNaturalist. Find out what is around you and share your wonderful discoveries with a community that shares that excitement. Join the MacroBlitz project today.
Okay. So that gives you the overview of MacroBlitz. And looking at the chat, some of you in the work that you're already doing with aquatic macroinvertebrates, it does that from a very kind of cursory, what I know based on your chat comments. MacroBlitz would be a good fit. It's a good fit for fitting when you want to involve people in your work, but you don't have the full-blown aquatic macroinvertebrate monitoring project time, money, staff. So I'm going to share with you, I'm a big believer in beginning with the end in mind. And I want to share with you what the MacroBlitz project looks like in iNaturalist, because I have a feeling like most of you probably would are sufficiently experienced enough that you know what that looks like. So this was a last minute decision of mine to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and move that link over to my screen, and then I will share screen and also put it in the chat so you can plink around by yourself, which is always dangerous because yeah, you'll be deep down a rabbit, but that's okay. Let me find my chat. All right, so what I just posted in the chat was the iNaturalist project for MacroBlitz. And if you can go ahead and click through. You can also follow along with me on my screen. So what we have here, what you're looking at right now, where I sent you to the link, is the project page for MacroBlitz. And you can see that MacroBlitz, a project, is what's on iNaturalist is called an umbrella project, meaning that it's made up of multiple collection projects. It's made up of adults, and adults specifically adult insects, adult aquatic insects, non-arthropods, freshwater crustaceans, nymphs and larvae. So these guys right here, nymphs and larvae, they're kind of the rock stars of the aquatic macroinvertebrate world. When you talk about macros, most people go to two things: insects and water quality. And that there's nothing wrong with that. We currently are our geographic range is North and South America, because that's where our entomologists are, again, insects. That's where our experts were located. And we'll just go ahead and click through on the nymphs page, since we had someone mention they were interested in dragonfly nymphs. And you can see here our most recent observations a day ago. And here's our leaderboard list. This list here, if you're not familiar with the way iNaturalist projects are set up, we have filtered all observations on iNaturalist for these specific taxa. That's how a collection project works. Years ago, it used to be on iNaturalist. If you set up a project, you could move individual observations in. That's no longer the case. That was killing the servers. The way it works now is when you set up a project, it's basically a really nice save search. And so every time I open the project, iNaturalist is going through the observations, looking for all the project requirements, observations that meets the project requirements. In this case, this particular list of taxa and this particular locations. Hawaii, interestingly enough, had to be its own location. And then the life stage nymph, they're saying, okay, we want damselflies, but we only want them in the nymph stage. So annotation is super important because if you don't say you want nymphs, you're going to get all the damselflies, including the adults and the molts and the, all the things. So we're just looking for them in their nymph stage. Okay, just continuing on with a very quick orientation. This set of menus, these are all the observations. This is the set observations that have been identified down to species. So there are 303 species that have been identified. For our purposes, we filter based usually on family, sometimes order, depending on the organism, because a lot of times you just can't make an identification down to species using a photo. You have to look at the mandibles or, the number of tarsal claws or toes or, things like this. I'm not quite sure how this guy got in here. Oh, no, this is, I'm sorry, because we're looking at the species. When you look at the species page, it shows you sort of the iconic photo of what this is. So that is why we're seeing an adult dragonfly in a project dedicated to nymphs. Here you have the people who've identified them. And then you have the 4,531 people who have observed them. So this is the end. This is where we're trying to go with these observations. So some of them are very, genus. There we've got some species. Jewel wings. Here we go. Nice generic mayfly. You don't need to get it beyond order for this. So look, sometimes I see insects. So people get very creative with their iNaturalist names. They did annotate it nymph, apparently. And oh, I'm not logged in. I forgot because this is my MacroBlitz account. And I do everything in my personal account. So anyway, that is the fast and furious overview of the iNaturalist, the MacroBlitz project on iNaturalist. Any questions so far? You can either unmute because we're a small group, or pop one in the chat, or raise your hand using the reaction buttons at the bottom, or if you're on an iPad, I believe we're at the top. All right, well, not hearing anything, I'm going to go ahead to our first set of instructions for Get Ready. Now, most of you sound like you are already out in the field collecting aquatic macroinvertebrates. So we'll just go through this very quickly. This series of slide decks that we're watching is from the MacroBlitz classroom. And if you go to macroblitz.org, right on the landing page, there's a link to join our Google Classroom. I will say you have to use a personal Gmail. And even if your school or your organization is a Google Workspace or a Google for Education domain, you still have to use the personal Gmail because we have the discount cut rate version of Google. And so domain to domain, it only allows personal Gmails to join the classroom. There you go. Who knew? I do now. It took me a while to figure that out. So we're going to talk about how to pick a good site for MacroBlitz and just some safety essentials, things I'm assuming that most of you are already very familiar with. When you think about your site, you want it accessible, legal, and safe. Accessible means you can get there easily without crossing private land, and that goes into legal, unless, of course, you have permission from the landowner. Each state has its own rules, its own laws about what is public land around water. Make sure you know them. In South Dakota, it is below the high water mark. So if there's woody vegetation, you can't go above it. So it generally means if there's a spot we want to access, we have to access it from like a bridge and like kind of crawl down, walking along the bridge and then walk in the water. Some places have private property rights going all the way into the water to the middle of the water body. And then, of course, safe. You want to make sure that, you know, there's no precipitous drop-offs. And this is particularly if you're bringing a group with you. You do you know your own risk tolerance. But you'll want to think about safety, especially underwater. All kinds of nasty stuff can be lurking under the water. Before you take a group out, you'll want to scout out your site, accessible, legal, and safe. Check for cell service. If something happens and you don't have self-service there, you want to know how far you have to go to find it. You'll want to make sure there's habitat. And then, of course, you want to spend some time MacroBlitzing yourself. Just because if you're bringing a group, they're going to want your help and you won't get to do the fun stuff. So get it out of your system so you can really concentrate on the group you're with. Some safety essentials. If you have any sort of wilderness first aid or first responder training, this should be a very familiar kit to you. Make sure you have drinking water, at least half a liter per person per hour. If you're going to be out there even longer, I'd bring more. And if it's hot, really think about that as well. You'll want a go prepared plan, and that's where you're thinking about the hazards and precautions. You'll want the number and location of emergency and medical services right there with you, and you will want a weather report. Don't ever go out without knowing what the projected forecasted weather is for 4 hours, at least 4 hours ahead. And then you'll want to let people know where you're going, who you're with, and when you'll be back. So that is that overview, pretty fast and furious. Get ready. We'll talk now about the gear that I recommend for MacroBlitz, with the caveat, if you already have your own gear for your program, everything you have already works. You don't have to go and get special gear, except for maybe some photographic equipment. So I'm just going to run through that list as well. And if we want to have a conversation about would this work, would that work, we can have that conversation at the end. Generally, well, this point will come up as we go along, so I'll just jump right in. We have 7 kinds of gear that we recommend, and none of them are required, and there's a reason for that. And your gear, of course, it sounds like we've got some people pretty experienced in this realm, but your gear walks back to your study design question. What are you trying to figure out by collecting these aquatic macroinvertebrates? And so our study design question simply is, what kinds of macroinvertebrates do you find when you churn and turn rocks in a stream or jab the vegetation and top layer of sediment with a net in a pond, wetland, or along a lakeshore? Basically, we're saying, what do you find when you turn over rocks or swish a net around in the water? That's all we want to know. And there's a reason we went that way. I don't know if we get into the full background of our study design question in this slideshow. In fact, I don't think we do, but we kept it really, really general to make it as accessible as possible. Our priority is accessibility. We would rather have a lot of kind of very simple observations spread over a wide geographic base than, you know, the hundred specimen sample from a very localized base. That was a trade-off decision we made. We don't have a minimum sample size because we are not doing water quality monitoring. That's hard for people to get their minds around. This is just a biodiversity presence data set. We are looking at a large geographic scale, everywhere from the Arctic down to Patagonia, and across multiple kinds of water systems. So we want to be useful to programs that do have gear requirements. So if we are requiring you who have you know, a rock basket to also get a kick net, that's going to be a barrier. So if you're using a rock basket to collect for another project, keep using the rock basket. You don't have to get the kick net. You know, whatever you're using is fine. Our gear list are 7 kinds of gear that you need. You need gear to collect and hold, pick up, take photos, isolate, measure, magnify, and finally be comfortable and safe. And we'll run through these, probably take photos. We'll jump into more when we do the photo session. Collect and hold. That sounds pretty much like what it is. I have several nets that I like to just collect the organisms and then hold them in a bucket. I like collapsible buckets because they're easy to transport. So this is actually sold as some sort of, I believe, a dish sink or a camping sink at a large online retailer that I will not name to avoid giving them any extra publicity, but I'm sure you can figure it out. You need gear to pick up your critters once they're in the bucket. So because I work a lot with inexperienced people, I just use pipettes and white spoons. Very simple. I don't use forceps because I do work with kids sometimes, and you know, it's the squishing is it can get it kind of bugs me. But if you do and you have entomology forceps, use those. But generally, you can you know, poke and scoop pretty well with just very basic equipment. It's also cheap. You'll need gear to take photos, and we'll talk more about that in the photography session. Isolate. That means you're going to want to get your organisms all by themselves. So when you take their picture and upload it to iNaturalist, the person who's identifying it is not thinking, are you talking about the mayfly or the predaceous diving beetle? They're both in there. Which one do you want me to identify? So as much as possible, you want to get an organism all by its lonesome. And for that, the good old-fashioned Petri dish. Other popular isolation chambers, as it were, you probably use them, ice cube trays, some other, you know, whatever you're using, whatever's popular, that works. Measure. And when we look at the photography, we'll have a good sense of why measuring is so important. But generally, that's the right and the rain index card with a grid on the back. Size is an indicator. And, you know, as data set in iNaturalist grows, it could be an interesting data point for someone at some point. Magnify. And since I've created this, the phone technology has actually leveled up. So for Androids and some iPhones, you'll want some sort of clip-on magnification device. I like this Zovo. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. It starts with an X, but it's easy and it looks good. Gets me some good pictures. You'll want gear to be comfortable and safe. So in a lot of my pictures, you'll see this little gardening stool. That's the comfort part. You'll also want gear to be safe and I'm referring specifically to your clothing, long pants, closed-toed shoes, long sleeves, sun hat. Personally, I don't use bugs repellent or anything like that when I'm out there, because we don't want to stress our little critters any more than we have to. So I find a long sleeve shirt does the job pretty well. And if it's so mosquito-y or whatever that I can't be out there with the gear I have, I just give myself permission to go home. Waders and boots are a good idea, but I would not use waders unless you know how to get out of them if you fall. Just kind of putting that out there. And there's Tanya in cold weather. She actually went out sweeping in cold weather. Props to her. So if you do go out in off seasons, be aware that you should dress appropriately. Oh, I believe this is my outfit when I go. I'm not wearing my sun hat though. So, all right. I've been talking quite a while. Do we want to pause and we have a number of people here are pretty experienced. Do you want to share some gear you have found really useful in your practice? Feel free to unmute if you'd like. I'm not seeing any hands or anything in the chat. Usually what happens is I go back talking, then that finally comes up in the chat. If that happens, we'll stop and we'll circle back around. No worries. I'm trying to decide. I think most of you are probably pretty familiar with how to find a macroinvertebrate. I'll just hit some of the highlights from the slide deck, just in case you are thinking about using the slide deck. So, and you sort of get a preview of what's in it. So let's talk about the habitat types, where you'll find your macroinvertebrates. You'll want to keep in mind oxygen, substrate, vegetation, and structure. That's what all macroinvertebrates need to survive. And we do a review of all the different structure, all the different elements. You'll want to keep in mind what kind of habitat you are sampling in, lotic or lentic. So if you are lotic, and the way I tell my students how to remember it, that is the flow, low flow, lotic. And then lentic is the still water, the lake. And the lentic has it's 3 of the same letters in the word lean. So you just kind of lean. So flow and lean. And they have different structures, different morphologies. And so, the critters you'll find different critters there, and you'll find them in somewhat different places. I will say that living on the prairie, where our streams and lakes tend to be slow, very lentic, and not only lentic, but warm, I never find your cold water, rushing stream organisms. It's a big deal for me to find like a mayfly. I get very excited. With lotic systems, you're going to look for rocks, plants in the stream, leaf litter, other decomposing organic material, detritus, things like that, submerged logs, sticks, and woody debris. And so basically the riffle areas, so places where you see the water rushing in little waves. And we include this picture by Amy Bartlett Wright from the Guide to Freshwater Invertebrates of North America. That was my first guide to aquatic macros. Sadly, it's out of print, which makes me feel old, but there's a nice little how many aquatic macroinvertebrates do you see in this photo, in this painting? I like the painting because it's, it brings out elements that in a painting that you don't always get with a photo. And this was used with copyright. So please don't pull this out and use it in another slideshow. Just, we have permission to use it in the slideshow. The answer key, same for the lotic habitats. And when you're doing a lentic survey, did I say lotic habitats? That was not changed. That should be, is that right? I think that heading is incorrect. I'm pretty sure that's a lentic habitat. Oh no, that's right. Sorry about that. Need to pay more attention. Lentic pond surveys, bank margins, overhanging vegetation, and submerged root mats, silt, sandal, grub substrate. That first few inches, dragonflies like to burrow down in that, snags and logs. Here we are with our lentic habitats. Same situation. All right. Okay, any questions about collecting? Anybody have a pro tip that they have found for collecting aquatic macroinvertebrates? And again, remember I said we're just doing nets in the water, turning rocks over, poking nets around. If you use a rock basket or a kick net, that's another means to do it. But that's outside the scope of what we're supporting people to do. Okay. Collecting macroinvertebrates. I'll just let you look at the slideshow itself. It's pretty self-explanatory. Basically, with in the lotic, in the flowing systems, you turn over rocks, you rub sticks, you kind of disturb the bottom, and you have your net downstream so that the water washes whatever gets loosened into the net. And with lentic habitats, you just kind of poke around with a net and then scoop up and put it into your holding tub. I will say that when you hold your organisms, I do like to keep them in the shade. Even though they're aquatic macroinvertebrates, I don't think we should intentionally stress them any more than they need to. And then we are a release. We don't keep them, we release them. You may have to, I should have mentioned back in the get ready, you need to find out if you need a permit to do this. I believe at one time the state of Pennsylvania required a fishing license to collect aquatic macroinvertebrates. It'll vary state by state. In South Dakota, as long as it's for personal use and not research, meaning you're going to preserve them and take them back to a lab to analyze, you don't need a permit. So, does any other state know what the rules are for looking at macros? And of course, no matter what we say, please verify, because if you get stopped by a conservation officer, it's not going to hold weight. Well, this guy on this internet said it would be okay. All right, let's talk about photographing macroinvertebrates, because this is where we start veering off from a lot of different programs. Like, there are a lot of really good citizen science, community science programs where you go out and you collect macroinvertebrates, and usually it has a water quality component to it. Like the Isaac Walt League and Critter Creeks, and I don't know, there's multiples out there, and I don't want to take away from them at all. But the value proposition for MacroBlitz is to photograph them. And so how do you do that? Well, just like how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. We will give you some tips to get you started, and are going back to the accessibility piece. We are very interested in what you can do with your phone, your camera that's in your phone. But since a lot of people have access to that technology, of course, you can level up and you can buy macro lenses, you can buy dedicated cameras, but we're starting out simple. So we're going to understand the purpose and we'll walk through the recommended equipment. Understand good phone macro photography practices, and then at the end, we'll talk about some advanced skills. So why do we need to take photos of our organisms that we're looking at? And we want to upload them to iNaturalist, that project we were looking at, and maybe some of you are still looking at now. And we want them identifiable to order, maybe family. So with that, you need to have a good general impression of size and shape. In birding, that's called GIS. And identification is more important than a beautiful photo. So my wintertime hobby is I go through photos of Odonata on iNaturalist looking for the nymphs to annotate them. And there are some gorgeous photos of dragonflies and damselflies, but they're like really close up of the face. And all the diagnostic characters are like out of focus or you can't see them. So some less patient person kind of made that comment a couple of times to people. So when you're taking photos of these critters, you'll want to be thinking about, okay, do I see gills, tails, antenna, wing pads, legs? And you'll want to make sure that as much of that information as possible is in the photo so that someone else who can come along and identify it. So here's a screenshot of of a crawling water beetle that Matthew, he came along and confirmed. So what is macro photography? Well, it's close-up photography of something small where the image is larger than the actual subject, which that doesn't really work grammatically, but bear with me. So in real life, this mayfly is about 1.3 centimeters or a half an inch long. And how do I know that? Well, I'm sort of measuring it against this backdrop. These backdrops are on the right in the rain cards are 6.35 millimeters or a quarter inch square. I see with the tail, this mayfly is about twice that. So, I can say it's about half an inch long. In the photo, it looks much bigger than that. That is the essence of macro photography. What kinds of equipment do you need? Well, a phone. And we're not going to really go into how to use your phone because if there's anything I've learned over this past year, there are so many different models and each one of them has its own instructions. Many phones, and certainly not all, have a macro mode, which is usually identified by the flower icon. Sometimes you can go in and intentionally activate it. Sometimes that macro mode is activated by just moving your phone closer to whatever it is you want to take a picture of. And some, like the later iPhone models, don't have it explicit at all. So this is really where you're going to need to get out and get your phone and get to know it well and how to get those good close-up pictures. I do suggest that you find the best lens on the back of your phone to which is that lens to take the best close-up pictures. And the way you do that is you activate your phone in the camera mode. And so I'm going to turn my camera on. Okay, so you can see I've got my camera. Hi, me. And then I'm going to take my pointer finger and put my finger over each lens individually. And when you get that finger looking spot, that is the lens that is the first macro lens on your phone. Now, later iPhone models will switch to another lens if that one's covered. But you'll want to know which one that is, because when we talk about putting on a magnification device, even on a later model iPhone, that's the one you're going to want to cover up. For Android and not so new iPhone models, you can you use that lens for your close-up photos and your magnification device. Okay, so I'll do it from this way so you can see what I'm doing. One finger at a time over the different lenses. Oops. And then this is the one that covers it up. So this is the one I'm going to keep my eye on and put my clip-on lens. Okay. So you can see the difference that a phone macro mode and not macro mode is. Like I said, not all phones have it, but both photos did have a clip-on magnifying lens. So it does make a difference. I suppose you could use your digital zoom. I haven't really tried that. So whatever, like I said, you're going to have to play with it to get the close-up detail that we're looking for. Talk about a magnifying lens, and it's to magnify the macroinvertebrates. I know my friend Tanya, you saw her in the habitat slide deck. She likes to use a field microscope with an ocular attachment for the cell phone. And I think back here you can actually see something to that effect. I generally use these clip-ons. There's this Easy Band, and ironically, they're like pretty inexpensive, but they work the best with iPhones. And if you can get their lens, they have a tiny little plastic lens, and if you get it over that iPhone lens on the phone, it does help. So, you know, whereas the clip-on lenses are too big or too something, maybe too many of the other lenses are covered. So the iPhone kind of is moving around to find an empty lens. Let's talk about actually taking the photo. Now that you have your camera all figured out, more or less, how do you take a good photo of an aquatic macroinvertebrate? Well, be aware of light and shadows, isolate the organism. We talked about that a little bit in the gear slide deck. Get as close as focus allows, take multiple photographs, and use objects for scale. So let's talk about light and shadow. Like all photography, light and shadow really matters. I call it, I set up my field photography studio, and on a bright sunny day, I'm out here with my friend Jen, and you can see it's bright and sunny. You're thinking, oh, it's great. We'll have so much light. The problem is, as you bring your phone in, it casts a shadow, and you're so close up that your phone is, you know, kind of wildly trying to focus and, you know, adjust for the light, and so your pictures don't turn out that great. So what I do is I intentionally put whatever I'm taking a picture of in light shade. You know, I know a lot of you, particularly in the Northeast, you're probably already under a pretty intense shade cover. You can see how much shade I have here on the prairie. Not a whole lot. So that's another reason I have my little stool, is if nothing else, I can put it in the shade of the stool. And what that does is it intentionally underexposes the photo. And that's what we're going for. But it will give you a consistent lighting so that you can get up close, get the focus, and then later on adjust it adjust the exposure, either through editing tools or, if you're really fancy, right in the app. So of course you can always take your photos. This is kind of fun. You can go out right after sunrise or right before sunset, and you have that beautiful low golden, golden hour sunlight. That's the best. But, I mean, are we really going to get up at 6:30 a.m.? I don't know. I'm just going to it's easy macro lens. Ann Haywood, I see that you're here. Could you look that up for me? You know the one I'm talking about, I think. And if you don't, I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Ann Haywood's a colleague of mine. We've worked together on projects, fellow National Geographic explorer, amazing person. And thank you, Haley, for coming. So, and if you need to peel off, please do so. The whole thing, as Bernie said at the beginning, will be on the YouTube, so you can just forward however many minutes that you've already watched and pick up where you've left off. You'll want to isolate your organism. Like I said, you want one at a time. And, clear cups, those little 8-ounce clear cups, so you can get it all by itself. It makes it easier for editing as well. Sometimes even I'll take a picture, I'll go through, and then I'll even crop this. Like this, I would probably crop quite a bit. All right, focus. Oh my gosh, you gotta love the focus. Yeah, because even though these pictures are still, that organism is moving around. And here we have this little, I think it's a chironomid, kind of doing his chironomid thing. And yeah, it's not easy. They go in focus, they go out of focus. If it's a larger organism, some of you are working with dragonflies, and they can be, well over an inch. So you get part of it in focus when you're up close, and then, part of it's out of focus. And unless you get stacking software, it's like, what do I do? So just be aware that these are things and challenges that you're going to encounter in the field. And eventually you will find the optimal distance, and it will always depend on the organism, of course. You'll want to take multiple photos. You're going to try to get all of it in, like I said. I find that if you have burst mode, that works really well. And you can take a lot of photos and you can save it as a GIF or a GIF. I'm not starting that conversation today, GIF or GIF. I'm using them both. And so you can kind of see. Thanks, Elizabeth. Use an object for scale. And so, like I said, we like Write in the Rain index cards. A box of them is about $12, depending, ironically, which color you use. I have found that the tan makes the best background. Even though you have a lot of organisms that are kind of tan colored, it just seems to make my very inexpensive Android the happiest. You can try different colors. I don't suggest white. Honestly, the white exposure even in cell phone is tricky. But I don't know, maybe you feel bold. If you think this is great, I want to do more, you can level up. You can get a dedicated camera, the Olympus TG. This is sort of the workhorse of many iNats. If you go to the iNat discussion forum and put in Olympus TG, you'll find multiple threads and long conversations about it. You could get a macro lens to a DSLR camera, and you'll also, along with that, hear a lot of conversations about flash diffusers, and somebody's engineered one up with a Pringles can, inventive bunch. So there's ways to do it. You'll want to learn about stacking software to solve that in focus, out of focus problem. So that basically what it does is it takes a series of in focus photos of different parts and then stacks them for one in focus photo, and then light and flash diffusers, like I said. So that is the photograph portion of the. Any questions? This is probably the if you're already doing aquatic macroinvertebrate monitoring, this is probably the newest part. And I wish I had a more definitive, absolute, this is going to work every time, but it's photography, it's live animals. You're just going to have to get out there and practice. So, but it's an excuse to get outside. It's getting almost nice enough here in South Dakota. I think I'm going to try to get out this weekend. Okay. Bernie, how are we doing on time?
We are doing well on time.
Okay.
We technically have 30 more minutes if we want to.
Okay. Sweet. Well, if folks are so inclined, and maybe those of you who are going to come back and join us, I will go ahead and run through identifying aquatic macroinvertebrates, specifically with an eye towards iNaturalist. That's kind of our context, and it's basically the same as you would do for any other program, but there are some things you'll want to think about for the iNaturalist piece of it. Go ahead and share my screen one last time. So we're going to talk about identifying aquatic macroinvertebrates, and we're going to go through the sort of the big ideas pretty quickly. This is the conservation biology organization after all. So we'll just skim right through there. So with identifying macroinvertebrates for iNaturalist, the goal is to get enough information in there so other people can find it. Usually when we think about identifying aquatic macroinvertebrates for whatever reason, it's for water quality assessment purposes. So, yet we have to be pretty confident in what we're saying, because we'll put it down on the sheet and it'll go into our, Department of Environmental Quality or Conservation, or, has a bunch of different names. And they're going to take it as sort of like, okay, this is what the data is telling us. That's not quite the reason that we need to know how I identify aquatic macroinvertebrates for iNaturalist. Essentially, science and learning require IDs. So the learning piece of it is when your organism is identified, it goes into the project that we looked at earlier. This project is great for practicing your identification skills. So that's one of the reasons, learning, that I'm encouraging people to put their identifications on. And then, of course, the science, the biodiversity, particularly the biodiversity piece of it. But the main reason we want an identification on your observation is to help the identifier community find your organism. So we need to put something in there. And this is a screenshot of the web upload. When you take a photo and you upload it to iNaturalist on the web, not through the app. The app is going through an upgrade. If I were to do a screenshot of what that looked like this year, by next year, it would look very different, particularly you iPhone users. You're going to be seeing some sweet stuff coming out pretty soon. I am so old school. I was on iNaturalist before there was an app. So get off my lawn while you're at it. I kind of feel old. So we want to put something in here so that people who love to identify organisms can find it. And that requires a different framing question. Your question is not, what is this organism? It's, what taxa does this organism belong to? That's the question you want to be asking. Because if you can't get it to species and genus, and unless you, like I said earlier, unless you absolutely know the defining characters at that level, you're probably not going to be able to, and you're probably not going to be able to show them in a photo. You're going to have to move up a little bit, to family or subfamily or order. So just to review, Bernie and I were talking about this, how many kingdoms are there now? Now I know there are domains and there are 3 kingdoms. When I went to school, there were only 2. I mean, they were still talking about protists, but yeah, they weren't official yet. Below that, we have phylum, classes, order, and family. And this is the level at which you are going to try to get an identification into iNaturalist. I mean, the kingdom, of course, if nothing else, put animal. Somebody else could get it further down the taxonomic level. Insects at the class level are the rock stars. I touched on that earlier. Everybody is automatically, when you say aquatic macroinvertebrates, thinks of insects. Insects are in the phylum Arthropod, and these are some aquatic invertebrates that are not arthropods, different phyla. And if you looked, if you're still looking or you have it open, if you hop over to the iNat project, you can see that we have collection projects for these. So some of the better known non-arthropods are flatworms, leeches, aquatic earthworms, snails, mussels, and clams. Now, there are arthropods that are not insects. Just so they have the jointed legs, but they don't have 6 of them. And the legs might not be attached to the thorax. So these arthropods are water mites and spiders, sow bugs, scuds and side swimmers. That's what this guy is down here, crayfish and shrimp. When we get, now we'll talk a little bit about the insect class. Now, there are lots of insects. There are only 9 orders of insect that have an aquatic stage. So hopefully, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, you can think like, okay, I can do 9. You know, once you realize it's only 9 you have to be able to have some familiarity with, that feels a little more feasible than, you know, you have to learn all the insects. So the ones that have larva and adult stages in aquatic habitats are the true bugs, the hemiptera, and the water beetles, the coleoptera. The ones that are larval and nymph stage, we have our rock stars of the rock stars. I mean, this is like the Taylor Swift and the, I don't know, the Rolling Stones of the bug world, the odonatas. Then we have the stoneflies, the mayflies, the Dobson flies, fish flies, and elder flies, the caddisflies and their adorable little sleeping bags, shoe flies, which everybody kind of boo because, you know, flies, and then butterflies and moths. And when I first started this, I was like, what? I have never seen a butterfly, an aquatic butterfly and moth. And I asked, and I was a very, very casual user when this started. And I talked to a couple of experts and they're like, no, I mean, they're not super common, but they're not rare either. And sure enough, yeah, I found one. So, and these have aquatic pupation, meaning they change, you know, they pupate under, in an aquatic setting. Insects, of course, the head, thorax, abdomen, you know, instead of head, shoulders, knees, and toes, you have the head, thorax, abdomen, head, thorax, abdomen. Some have pro legs, others have 6-jointed legs. Camp counselor, yeah. Head is where you'll find the eyes and antenna. The thorax is where the legs and wings attach. The abdomen, and I have this straight from a PhD entomologist, is where you will find the squishy bits. Amanda Bachman, Dr. Amanda Bachman. The legs, there are always 6 of them. They're jointed and they have a tarsal claw at the end. You may or may not be able to see that with your magnification device even. If you're not familiar with it, I suggest you take a look at macroinvertebrates.org. This has your most commonly found aquatic macroinvertebrates, insects. There are a couple of key insects that are missing, like in the coleopteras. I've found a couple and I was like, they're not really in any of the common public friendly guides. Those of you who are doing PhD level work, master's level work, you probably are using the name is escaping me of the guide, but the ones the rest of us use, like the marsh beetle, I've not found that in any of the kind of casual user guides. So your tips, observe closely. You'll want to notice, does it have a head? Does it have legs? However, how many? What about the abdomen? Are there tails, gills? Hand lenses are helpful for this. So let's practice identifying the taxa. Let's see, I'll just go ahead. Which is the insect? Now that you have known, I'll just go back. Most of you will know this. Insects have the head, thorax, abdomen, and legs, which have the head, thorax, abdomen, and legs. And this is a little bit of a trick question. Anybody want to drop something in the chat or unmute? We'll do 1, 2, 3, 4. Give you a moment more. All right. Yeah, trick question. This guy, of course, head, thorax, abdomen. It's even got some tails. It's got the 6 legs. Black fly larva. Ah, not fair. Yeah, I said prolegs. So it's always good to use these guidelines as just that, as guidelines. When you look at enough of these things, you'll be like, oh yeah, that's a black fly. There is no substitute for actually getting out in the field and just looking and looking and looking and looking. Use multiple dichotomous keys to help you key things out. We do have a dichotomous key for download on the MacroBlitz, in the MacroBlitz classroom. Yeah. And then invest in a print field guide. So again, I'm old school. There's something about a print field guide that you can read about it that you just can't get from an online. So going back to our iNaturalist, preliminary IDs help your observation be found by the identifier community for confirming or refining identifications. So I go through a lot of Odonata, and I see a lot of them identified at the Odonata level when it's pretty easy to identify, but bring it down a level. So I'm really just refining the observation. I'm not, finalizing it. I'm not getting it to research grade, but it's a more specific piece of information, and that could be useful now or in the future. Again, like I said, practice, practice, practice. And that is the fast and furious overview of how to identify, how to really, I think most of you probably know how to identify, how to support others in identifying aquatic macroinvertebrates. So with that, one last opportunity for questions. Okay, I'll put the website in the chat. Well, maybe I'll just go ahead and share my screen and then I'll put it in the chat again. Now that Bernie's come back. So it'll be macroblitz.org. And then you scroll down and this has the link to the Google Classroom. And I'll put this in the chat. Okay, now I'm done for real.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was fantastic, same as last time. So again, there's a little bit of room for questions, but if not, or folks don't have any questions, then I believe we can transition to offline questions if needed, right, Anne? Like, feel free to reach out to me or Anne directly if you have any questions. And then I've also added a post-event survey in the chat for those of you that are able to fill it out. It'll help us with just general feedback for future events, and also help us think about how else we can improve our professional development opportunities. So again, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Anne, once more for leading today's session.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. This is fun. I love talking about this stuff.